Welcome to this e-learning module, Gender, produced by the Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Minnesota. This work is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, Share-alike 4.0 International License. When you complete this module, you should be able to define gender, sex, queer, essentialism, social construction, performativity, LGBT, hetero and homonormative, masculinity and femininity, and cisgender and transgender. You will learn that gender is a complex, contested category which feminists and queer scholars and activists have theorized, debated, resisted, and shifted. Gender is a term taken for granted. You may think of sex as in the body, gender as appearance or presentation, and sexuality as who you desire. However, we'll deconstruct these terms and see that they're really interrelated. For many, gender is either linked to or interchangeable with sex. Gender is man or woman. For others, gender is the social status assigned to men and women. Gender is a set of practices, behaviors, and expectations we have of men and women, which are not natural, but socially constructed. However it's defined, gender is intersectional, meaning that it is inextricably entwined with race, class, sexuality, nationality, and other axes of distinction. As such, gender takes different forms with different social groups. In this module, you will explore how gender is rooted in power relationships that shift across scales of difference such as age, ability, race, class, sexuality, and geographic location. Have you ever heard someone say something along the lines of, "Women are more nurturing than men," or, "Because of all that testosterone, men are drawn to positions of power"? If you have, you've encountered gender essentialism. Gender essentialism is a theory of gender difference which holds that there are certain natural, indeed universal characteristics or properties that all men or all women possess. To say that testosterone accounts for men's desire for power is to imply that because of hormones, men are hardwired to seek out positions of power. The statement also indicates that testosterone is what determines masculinity, and moreover, that all biological men are inherently masculine, which manifests in a desire for power. Both statements imply a comparison between men and women that translates into the social, political, and economic roles we assign them. Essentialists maintain that gender is rooted in biology, neurology, and genetics. Some believe that differences between men and women are the natural outgrowth of human evolution. For example, women work best in the home because they were historically gatherers, while men seek public positions because they were historically hunters. And those inclinations are somehow genetically hardwired. For this reason, you'll also hear scholars call gender essentialism biological or cultural determinism. Sometimes gender essentialism is less obvious. Recent debates over the gay gene reveal a gender essentialism that seems politically progressive. To explain, scientists are searching for a possible gay gene that will explain queer desire as a biological trait. For some, this is a much-needed vindication. If queerness can be proven natural, then no one can argue that it's a social aberration. At the same time, naturalizing queer desire in this way can lead to a cure for it, and such genetic modification would be a privilege reserved for the upwardly mobile. Additionally, this presumes that desire is something that is linked to biology and not influenced by other circumstances or experiences. The gay gene debate is perhaps more obviously dealing with sex essentialism. This is about sexuality and desire, but it is importantly linked to gender. We can take away a few key points from gender essentialists. First, many people and medical professionals believe that gender is equivalent to sex, that it is rooted in the body. They also believe that one's sexuality is similarly inherent, that one is born identifying as female or gay, for example. Second, gender essentialists believe that there is always a natural reason for gender differences. Third, gender essentialism may be perpetuated by both politically conservative and progressive persons. Social constructionists believe that gender is ultimately the product of social norms that shift over time and differ from place to place. Social norms are rules or codes of conduct that set the parameters for what is considered normal. As social norms serve the interests of power, it is usually systems of dominance, such as patriarchy, white supremacy, empire, and capitalism, that define for us what is normal human behavior. If it appears that women are more nurturing, it is because there is a system of power in place that necessitates and rewards that kind of behavior from women. Social constructionists see the two-sex system as a social norm with significant power. Anne Fausto Sterling writes that, quote, Western culture is deeply committed to the idea that there are only two sexes. Biologically speaking, there are many gradations running from female to male, and depending on how one calls the shots, one can argue that along the spectrum lie at least 5 sexes, perhaps even more, end quote. Fausto Sterling's critique points to the regulation of intersex individuals as evidence that the two-sex/gender system is not natural, but rather something that must be maintained. Suzanne Kessler similarly confirms that sex ambiguities are medically eliminated during infancy. Doctors encourage parents of intersex children to decide on a gender so that proper socialization can begin. When determining how to treat intersex infants as either male or female, doctors frequently base their decisions on the size of clitoris or phallus. If its appendage is longer than 2 inches, doctors recommend that the patient be raised male. If the appendage is smaller, doctors recommend the patient be raised female. Social construction theory of gender understands that gender norms are different across time, place, and cultural difference. There are different gender norms in place based on one's racialization and sexualization. The gendered norms for white women in the U.S. are different than those for black women. Gender norms for Asian women are different than those for Asian American women, which are different from Native American women, Latina and Chicana women, and Southeast Asian women. These differences are often due in part to racial and colonial histories and the current politics of global capitalism. Differences within these groups exist as well, depending upon class, nationality, ability, sexuality, religion, and innumerable other factors. Thus, the norms for white femininity represent the privileges of whiteness. Women are seen as fragile, domestic, and keepers of the family and the nation. The norms for black womanhood are determined by histories of slavery and racism, while those for Chicana women represent colonialism and the ongoing conditions of violence in the borderlands, and expectations for Asian women emerge from Orientalist imaginings of the East. 3 key points about social construction of gender. Gender is a process of socialization very much determined by cultural norms and power. Although gender is a social construction, it is not merely a fiction we can will ourselves out of. Biology is not insignificant. The discourse created by and about sex very much informs how we script ourselves and others as gendered beings. Ricky Ann Wilkins states that, quote, gender refers not to something we are, but to something we do, through extended repetition, end quote. Some scholars believe that social constructionist perspectives ignore how gender is a lived interpretation of norms. They worry that social constructionist thought posits gender norms in a top-down fashion, where structures of power instruct people how to live and identify. People and communities grapple with social norms, reproducing and enforcing them just as much as any structure of power. In order to grasp this, we need to have an understanding of gender as a doing, a performance, or an ongoing process of making and unmaking the realities that surround us and how they compel us to identify. How does this image show gender being done? What is each person doing to signify gender in this picture? People are not conscious of this process, however. The ironic thing about doing gender is that we don't even know we're doing it. Feminist theorist Judith Butler calls this the performativity of gender. Gender is a reiteration of norms that ultimately elude us. For Butler, it is our reliance upon norms that perpetuates them. But we're socialized to depend upon such conventions, so that we can't really opt out of doing gender. Gender performativity is intersectional. However you are able to perform gender is linked to your race, class, sexuality, ability, nationality, and religion. Privileged persons, people who are white, upwardly mobile, and able-bodied, are more able to be read how they wish because there is a socio-political structure that favors them. Persons whose socio-political situation is more precarious don't have this luxury. More often than not, the way that we read persons who are of color, poor, differently abled, and or colonial is pre-scripted. The stereotypes which accompany these positions are often more difficult to thwart than the scripts of white masculinity or white femininity. Because gendered performances are determined by other factors, such as race, class, sexuality, nationality, and so on, it can be challenging or difficult for marginalized people to enact certain gendered performances. Remember, maintaining gender norms is part of a system of social control. Although we cannot opt out of doing gender, there might be ways in which we can complicate our reliance on gendered norms by remaining critical of their politics. Can you think of some gendered stereotypes about people of another race, class, sexual orientation, nationality, or religion from you? Given what we've reviewed today, what purpose do you think these stereotypes serve to maintain social power for dominant groups? These terms are ones you've likely used in your gender, women, and sexuality studies, or gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender studies coursework, LGBT, queer, cisgender, transgender, heteronormative, homonormative, and masculinities and femininities. LGBT is an acronym used to describe persons and/or politics that are lesbian, gay, bisexual, and/or transgender. At times, you'll see this initialism written as LGBTQ, where Q, or queer, comes to represent those persons who are gender non-normative. LGBT is associated with the political mainstream. As such, many LGBT groups mobilize around cultural visibility, marriage rights, equal representation under law, protected class status, and universal recognition, all of which require one to claim gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender identity and position within mainstream social politics. Many communities of color and/or non-Western communities resist inclusion under the LGBT banner because the rights many LGBT activists fight for have troubling consequences on racialized communities. On this note, mainstream LGBT activism tends to be Eurocentric, presuming that gender and sex minorities are classes that transcend national boundaries and cultures. Queer studies, queer theory, queering gender, queer subjects, and queer sexuality are all terms you'll likely hear and use in your GWS coursework. Although queer means many different things to different people, we can provisionally define it as gender trouble. Queer theory is invested not only in understanding how masculinity and femininity become normalized, but in questioning what purpose gender serves in the first place. Why do we even identify? Queer subjects and sexualities are thus persons and desires that cannot be described or understood within a normative framework. Although queer studies is interested in exploring such persons, desires, and events, it does so with the intention of understanding, however provisionally, the existence of gender phenomena that continues to mystify and resist explanation. Queer of color critique insists that queer thought is often based in white, Eurocentric theories of gender and subjectivity that render other contexts, for example race, class, nationality, or ability, unimportant to the construction of queer thought and subjectivity. While many scholars recognize queer studies to be the corrective to the limitations of LGBT studies and movements, we must bear in mind that queer has similar limitations. Cisgender describes persons who have a match between the gender they were assigned at birth, their bodies, and their behaviors. That is, if someone has a penis, was assigned male status, and behaves in ways consistent with cultural expectations of masculinity, then that person is said to be cisgender or cis-male. The usefulness of the term is that, unlike gender normative, or gender conforming, it does not presume that there is a universally agreed upon system of gender norms. Typically, we think of transgender people as those whose gender identity does not match what was assigned to them at birth. Medical discourse has diagnosed this condition as gender dysphoria, and argues that transgender is an affect people have when they believe themselves to be born into the wrong body. Although the wrong body script is sometimes espoused by trans persons, particularly those hoping to undergo transition surgeries, this psychosocialized depiction of transgender ignores the more complicated moments when the desire to transgress gender norms or to change one's body does not stem from such a belief, but instead perhaps as a refusal of gender normativity. Trans theorist and activist Susan Stryker explains, quote, "Transgender analyses of gender oppression and hierarchy, unlike more normative feminist analyses, are not primarily concerned with the differential operations of power upon particular identity categories that create inequalities within gender systems, but rather on how the system itself produces a multitude of possible positions that it then works to center or marginalize." End quote. Transgender practices and identities can be very powerful analytically, as they compel us to think about the contradictions of sex, gender, and sexuality heteronormativity and homonormativity perceive as natural. Heteronormativity is a system of power that upholds the two-sex, two-gender system, man-woman, male-female, as a universal fact. It presumes that sex, body, gender, appearance, and sexuality, desire, are naturally aligned, that men and women desire each other. Heteronormativity normalizes heterosexuality and cisgender bodies. Think of examples in your daily life which are structured by heteronormativity. Do you live in gender-segregated dorms? Do people ever ask you what your mom and dad are like, or if you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend? Where else is it assumed that being heterosexual is the norm? Homonormativity describes the assimilation of heteronormative scripts by lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender communities. The term was first used by American Studies scholar Lisa Dugan to describe the ways that gay communities at times embrace, rather than critique, the fundamentally exclusionist ways of things like monogamy, marriage, and procreation. Homonormativity intends to leave normative practices and systems of identification intact, but merely expand them to include LGBT people. The struggle for gay marriage is a quintessential example of homonormativity. While arguing for equal rights under the law with straight couples, many proponents of gay marriage fail to critique marriage as an institution. Masculinities and femininities operate as gendered categories or identities in very regulatory and liberatory ways. Gender identity and sexual orientation are often confused under heteronormativity. For example, straight men are expected to follow a certain gendered script that depends upon aggression, indifference, or physical strength, while straight women are expected to follow a certain gendered script that depends upon sensitivity, empathy, or docility. When there are variations, new gendered categories are created to preserve the investment in heteronormativity. For example, the term metrosexual. On the other hand, gay men are often effeminized, while gay women are often masculinized by cultural and medical discourses, positions derived from the failure to be really masculine. Historically, there was little distinction made between homosexuals and gender inverts. It was simply understood that men who desired men displayed feminine traits or behaviors and wanted to be women, and women who desired women displayed masculine traits or behaviors and wanted to be men. Today, the visibility of gays and lesbians continues to rely upon effeminacy and butchness, respectively, to the extent that queer femininity often gets erased because it's assumed to be straight. In effect, heteronormativity enforces stereotypes of heterosexuals on lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender populations. However, these populations are not completely beholden to these expectations. Many queer populations have redefined masculinity and femininity in ways that contradict the heteronormative script. Here are the references for this module.